People think of academia as a haven of integrity, quiet halls filled with truth seekers in lab coats, the pure pursuit of knowledge above ambition. That's what I believed too, once. My name is Dr. Clara Mirov, Associate Professor of Cognitive Neuroinformatics at Kepler University, and for over 12 years I had built a reputation not by chasing tenure or funding headlines, but by building something far rarer: trust. I specialized in neural learning models, algorithms designed to replicate the human brain's adaptive behavior under ambiguous stimuli. My lab, modest in size but elite in talent, had published breakthrough results in what we called RST, recursive symbolic transfer, a model that could teach itself not just what to do, but how to revise its own assumptions. It wasn't just code, it was cognitive evolution, line by line. My team was small, select. I mentored each student closely, especially doctoral candidates. And among them, I had high hopes for one in particular, Julian Rayner. Julian was brilliant. No one doubted that. He had a way of asking questions that cut through the noise, and while he lacked some of the patience required for long-term research, I saw that as a teachable trait. He worked closely with me on the final architecture of RSTV3, the model we hoped to submit to Nature-Machine Intelligence, a submission that could elevate not just our lab, but the entire department. One afternoon, I noticed Julian had cleared his desk. When I asked, he smiled thinly and said he'd be finishing his writing from home to avoid interruptions. I didn't press. He was independent. I trusted him. It was a Thursday. 4 weeks later, I saw his name trending on X, and beside it, Julian Rayner unveils groundbreaking AI model, recursive adaptive reasoning, a new frontier. The screenshot of the architecture they showed on the news? I didn't need to zoom in. I had built those matrices. By hand. At first, I thought it was a mistake. A coincidence. Some early prototype we'd both worked on that he had somehow reframed. But as I watched the 7-minute interview he gave to a tech startup podcast, my fingers went cold on the keyboard. Julian spoke in polished sound bites. He described recursive adaptive reasoning, RAR, as his independent doctoral innovation. He talked about the quote, conceptual leap he'd made in late spring. The same week I had finalized RSTV3's recursive token pruning. He used phrases I'd coined in internal memos. He referenced a symbolic compression method I had outlined during a closed research colloquium. That presentation wasn't even recorded. And then he said it, smiling slightly, eyes sharp. I think academic labs tend to slow down real breakthroughs. I needed space to move faster. I sat in my office, staring at the paused video. My whiteboard behind me still bore the annotated flowchart of RSTV3. Julian hadn't just borrowed language. He had taken the core framework. He had rebranded my work with a sleeker name and passed it off as his own. The betrayal was surgical. I opened my files, internal drafts, email threads, Git commit logs, timestamps. My heart raced as I pieced together the timeline. Julian had cloned the RSTV3 repo 6 days before his departure. The logs showed a local fork, renamed. He had stripped attribution metadata. And worse, the final branch he presented publicly as RAR was functionally identical to RSTV3, with only superficial syntax changes and adjusted parameter labels. I filed a report with the university's Office of Research Integrity. It took 4 days for someone to call me back. The voice was tight, neutral. We understand this is upsetting, but if you didn't sign a formal IP disclosure for that specific code branch, we may have limited recourse. I hung up and sat in the silence. I had spent 4 years developing that model. I had presented Julian with a protected repository because I believed he was ready for trust. He had downloaded it, scrubbed it, and walked out. And now the world was calling him a genius. Articles exploded across every corner of tech media. Wired. The Verge. Scientific American. Investors began circling Julian's name. MIT Technology Review named him to their, quote, top 35 innovators under 35. And in every mention of RAR, not a single footnote or credit linked back to me or my lab. I emailed him. I kept it short. Julian, I've reviewed your RAR announcement and recognize it as a derivative of RSTV3, developed under my direction. I expect an immediate correction of attribution and will be initiating formal review. Dr. Mirov. He never replied. The next week, I received a cease and desist letter from his lawyer. It claimed that any, quote, similarity between RST and RAR was coincidental, and that my statements were defamatory and potentially damaging to his startup's valuation. He had launched a company. It was already in talks with 2 major venture firms. One of them had once rejected my lab's proposal for RST funding, citing it as theoretical and slow-moving. Julian's betrayal wasn't just professional theft. It was a surgical rebranding of my identity, made palatable to a world obsessed with disruption. My department head, Drive, Lasker, asked to chat informally. He looked uncomfortable as he gestured toward my office door, half closing it. Clara, I know this feels personal, but maybe there's a collaborative resolution here. Maybe reach out quietly? I stared at him. He plagiarized me. Lasker didn't meet my eyes. It's a gray zone, technically, and Julian's visibility could help the department. I laughed. It was bitter, not because I thought it was funny, but because the betrayal had now multiplied. Julian had stolen my work, but the institution I had served for over a decade didn't want justice. They wanted silence. They wanted association with fame more than truth. That night, I walked home through sleet with my coat open, my mind burning. When I reached my apartment, I opened a new document. Title: Legal Grounds for IP Misappropriation in Graduate Research Settings. Then I opened another folder. Evidence. Git logs. Version history. Colloquium outlines. Meeting transcripts. Screenshots. I wasn't going to argue on principle. I was going to win on proof. But first, I had to stop grieving the betrayal and start planning its reversal. The first realization came slowly, like morning light through closed curtains. No one was coming to save me. The university wouldn't back me. Julian had already constructed his narrative, polished and public. And in the court of tech opinion, speed and spotlight drowned out nuance and substance. If I wanted justice, I would have to fight for it myself. Not emotionally, not with rage, but with surgical precision. So I began mapping the war. I consulted 2 friends, one in intellectual property law, one in research ethics. They both responded within hours of seeing the Git logs. You have a case, said Marcus, the lawyer. Not just academic theft. This is potentially criminal-level misappropriation if you can prove financial intent. He recommended a litigation firm in D.C. that specialized in academic IP theft. I called them that Friday. By the end of the call, I had a lawyer assigned to my case, Ava Markell, sharp as a scalpel. She asked me 3 questions before taking it on. Do you have dated documentation? Yes. Are you prepared for this to get ugly? Yes. Can you stomach watching him stay successful? For a while we fight? I paused. Then, yes. That weekend, I turned my apartment into a command center. I printed out every draft of the RST architecture, each time-stamped, each annotated with my initials. I color-coded Git diffs between RSTV3 and Julian's RAR, highlighting where he had only renamed variables, not restructured logic. I recovered the audio from our internal research meetings, which clearly captured me walking Julian through recursive feedback layers, 2 months before his supposed eureka moment. Every night I documented. Every morning I meditated. No emails to Julian, no reactive posts. I was done asking for recognition. I wanted legal accountability. And something more. a clean slate. Because as I built my case, I realized something even deeper. The betrayal wasn't just that Julian had stolen RST. It was that I had built everything within a system that saw my work as invisible until someone louder claimed it. Kepler University didn't see a problem with losing a quiet researcher, so long as a flashier face carried the work forward. It wasn't just one theft. It was a culture. So I started planning something parallel. My exit. A year before, I'd drafted a speculative plan for a research institute that wouldn't answer to university boards or tenure-track politics. I pulled the file out. NOVA, the Nonlinear Observation and Validation Agency. A terrible name. But the bones were solid. An independent research lab, lean and private, where postdocs could pursue rigorous, interdisciplinary I work with real IP protections and full attribution pipelines. A place that didn't just tolerate integrity, it demanded it. I redrafted the concept, sharpened the scope, estimated funding minimums. I sold my car, cashed out a modest inheritance my grandmother had left me. I applied for a private research grant under a pseudonym just to test interest. It was approved in 6 weeks. As the lawsuit began to unfold, letters, filings, subpoenas, I was already laying bricks elsewhere. Julian had stolen one thing, but I would build something he couldn't touch. Litigation doesn't move like movies. It doesn't surge. It creeps. It tests your patience, your resolve, your identity, but it also gives you time to prepare. By the time the first court summons reached Julian's new startup, RAR Labs, headquartered in San Francisco with a valuation north of $40 million, I was already halfway through construction on NOVA. We set up in a converted warehouse in the outskirts of Boston. Clean, angular, functional. 3 rooms, one for development, one for testing, and one, dimly lit and silent, for thinking. I hired my first team carefully. No Ivy credential chasing. I looked for research purists, people who still felt awe when a line of code taught a machine something unexpected. The first was Eileen, a postdoc who had built a neural model that mimicked marine foraging behavior. Then Isaiah, a cryptography engineer, who left a defense contractor after their funding got reallocated to surveillance AI. We were different. We liked it that way. We rebuilt RST from scratch, this time not in Python, but in a hybrid C++ architecture for greater runtime transparency. We renamed it Aletheia, Greek for truth. It could learn recursive constraints and audit its own inferences, something no other architecture could do reliably. Meanwhile, Ava, my lawyer, filed a discovery motion that forced Julian to hand over his source files. What we received confirmed everything. Time-stamped commit logs showed cloned metadata from my original repo. Even some of the comments in the code, written in my shorthand, had been left in. It was like finding your own fingerprint on someone else's trophy. Still, Julian's legal team fought back hard. They argued that the architecture's mathematical principles were not patentable. That, quote, general structures of recursive reasoning couldn't be owned, that it was just inspiration. But we had evidence. And it was damning. One document did more damage than anything else. A Slack thread Ava recovered through subpoena between Julian and a former classmate. In it, Julian wrote, "It's basically her version, Mirov's, but I scrubbed the traceables. Academic credits don't matter in startups. I'll clean it before launch." Those exact words made it into the court record. When I read them, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sick. He hadn't just taken my work. He had calculated it. He had commodified trust. But I didn't react. I didn't call him. I didn't leak it. I let the process unfold. We filed a motion for injunctive relief to halt all monetization of RAR Labs IP until the ownership question was resolved. That made headlines. Suddenly, tech media started circling. Academic AI Pioneer files lawsuit against startup Wunderkind. Investors froze. The seed round collapsed. Julian, ever the performer, went on record with TechCrunch to call it, quote, an attack on innovation by a bitter ex-professor. That week, I released a 2,000-word public brief detailing the full development path of RST, with documentation, side-by-side code comparisons, and a statement signed by 5 researchers who had reviewed both architectures. I ended the post with a line I wrote at 2 a.m. Credit is not a favor. It's the currency of trust in science. It went viral. In the background, Nova kept growing. We released Aletheia under a limited academic license. The white paper was downloaded 16,000 times in its first week. Researchers from Zurich, Kyoto, and Sao Paulo emailed asking to collaborate. And then came the TED invitation. At first, I declined. I didn't want to be a figurehead. But Ava encouraged me. The court will deliver a legal verdict, she said. You have a chance to deliver a moral one. So I spoke. Not about Julian. Not directly. I spoke about what happens when truth is treated as optional. I described how trust is not a branding strategy, but the oxygen of innovation. How theft in academia is not only unethical, but corrosive to the collective brain of science. People listened. 2 weeks later, the court granted a partial ruling in my favor. Julian was ordered to cease use of all materials derived from RSTV3. RAR Labs was barred from operating commercially until the full IP case was resolved. Julian finally called me. After 16 months of silence. I made a mistake, he said. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just said, yes, you did. Then I hung up. The final trial began on a bright Monday morning in the Federal District Court of Massachusetts. My team sat behind me, Ava to my left, Isaiah and Aileen quietly taking notes in the gallery. Julian was across the room, flanked by 2 attorneys and a publicist, dressed in a gray suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary when I was a professor. The courtroom wasn't crowded, but it was watched. Journalists from Nature, Wired, and the Chronicle of Higher Education filled the back row. Cameras weren't allowed, but their pens moved fast. Ava opened with surgical precision. She walked the jury through the documented evolution of RST, from my earliest sketches on university letterhead to the recorded code commits, meeting transcripts, and the Slack message where Julian admitted, quote, scrubbing the traceables. Julian's team leaned hard on ambiguity. They argued that neural models evolve in parallel, that intellectual convergence was common. They showed overlays of other recursive models published in open journals and tried to frame RST and RAR as cousins rather than clones. But they made a mistake. They underestimated how much of the work wasn't just in the code, but in the thought structure. Ava brought in Dr. Camille Su, an independent AI ethicist from Stanford, as an expert witness. Camille had reviewed both RST and RAR independently and testified that RAR's core structure was not merely derivative, it was architecturally dependent on RST. Any claim of independent development, Camille said under oath, would require implausible telepathy. It was a brutal line. The courtroom chuckled. Even the judge didn't suppress a smile. Julian looked smaller each day of the trial. His confidence frayed. The press started turning. Articles appeared with headlines like Brilliance or Betrayal, the line between inspiration and theft in AI. Still, I didn't celebrate. I took notes. I stayed quiet. Let the evidence speak. On the 6th day, I took the stand. I was calm, controlled. I walked the jury through my process, explaining what RST meant. Not just technically, but why it mattered. I described the nights I spent writing algorithms by hand, the years of peer review, the internal validation protocols. I explained how science isn't just about outcomes. It's about rigor, reproducibility, and attribution. Ms. Mirov, Julian's lawyer asked me, do you believe Julian Rayner is incapable of original thought? I paused, then said, clearly, I believe he made a choice, one that prioritizes gain over truth. And that's the danger. Not ignorance, but indifference. When the jury returned, they didn't look at Julian. The foreman stood. We find in favor of the plaintiff, Dr. Clara Mirov, on all counts. They awarded injunctive relief, full credit reassignment, and damages for IP misappropriation. More importantly, the court ruled that RST was the intellectual foundation of RAR and that Julian had knowingly presented it without attribution. He wouldn't go to jail. But the damage was done. RAR Labs collapsed within 2 weeks. Investors pulled out. Partnerships dissolved. Julian released a statement about, quote, stepping back to reflect. His name, once synonymous with brilliance, was now followed by an asterisk. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It came 3 months later, when the first peer-reviewed paper citing Aletheia passed open review with unanimous commendation. It was published in Nature Machine Intelligence, the journal I had once hoped to reach under Kepler's name. And on the opening page, the first footnote read, "This work builds on the original recursive symbolic transfer model, first developed by Dr. Clara Mirov, 2018 to 2022, and rebuilt independently under verified authorship through Nova Research." That footnote mattered more to me than any courtroom ruling. It was a record, not just of justice, but of recovery. Sometimes I think about how easily the world accepts a narrative when it's presented with enough confidence. How Julian smiled into cameras, speaking in my phrases, while I sat in a quiet office rebuilding everything I'd lost. How close he came to getting away with it all. But truth has a longer half-life than hype. Today, Nova is a recognized center for ethical AI development. We operate with a strict attribution ledger. Every idea, every contribution is time-stamped and credited, no matter how small. Our motto, carved into the steel above the entrance, reads, "Integrity is intelligence." I see it every morning when I walk in. We now partner with 3 global universities, several NGOs, and a medical diagnostics firm in Nairobi, using Aletheia to improve patient prediction models in rural hospitals. None of it was part of the plan I had when I first became a professor. But maybe that's the point. What we build when the plan is shattered is more honest than what we build when it goes smoothly. I still get asked about Julian. Reporters want a quote. Students whisper about him. But I never dwell. He made his choices. And I made mine. What I learned, painfully and precisely, is this. Recognition is not something you beg for. It's something you defend. There will be people in every field, especially in academia and tech, who believe that ideas are free for the taking, that credit is optional, and that fame justifies shortcuts. They will use charm to obscure theft, speed to mask plagiarism, and platforms to rewrite history. But the truth is meticulous. And when you are calm, strategic, and prepared, it wins. This story wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation. Reclaiming my work. Reclaiming my name. Reclaiming the belief that doing things the right way is not naive. It's radical. It's rare. And it's worth everything. So to the professor wondering if it's too late to speak up, to the graduate student afraid their silence will protect no one but their thief, to the researcher building something alone while the world looks elsewhere, this is your reminder. You're not weak for being honest. You're not alone for being careful. You're not small for not seeking applause. You're just early. And when the noise dies down, and the spotlight fades, and the funding rounds dissolve, what remains, quiet and shining, is the truth. It always does.